Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen, and as always, I'm here with Paul. And Paul, there's some information that is coming out that has the potential to see the Ukraine conflict come to an end. What is that information? Well, that's something we're going to discuss. But first, let's talk about what's going on between Trump and Zelensky. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this conversation. And what have you been hearing along those lines?
Well, first off, Ken, great you've joined today. And fortunately, Ken couldn't yesterday because he had some technical gremlins, but that's a whole different issue. But yeah, what I thought we would do today is discuss certain points relating to Ukraine. And one of them relates to the fact that Trump has spoken to Zelensky. It appears the conversation was pretty civilized, so that's an improvement. By all accounts, Zelensky has agreed to stop attacking Russian energy facilities. There was an agreement between Putin and Trump what was supposed to happen was the Russians and the Ukrainians were going to agree not to attack each other's energy infrastructure. And by all accounts, obviously, Russia agreed to this, so much so that they intercepted 7 of their own drones and shot them down, so they didn't destroy a Ukrainian energy facility. Obviously, Zelensky didn't agree to anything because he hadn't been spoken to and proceeded to attack Russian energy facilities in Krasnodar. Apparently now he's agreed to stop doing that, presumably because he has had the conversation with Trump, and Trump's asked him directly to do so. Now, that's supposed to be in place for 30 days. That is in no way, shape, or form a ceasefire agreement. It's just merely a small added kind of line item in terms of what could be done to try and begin to formulate something approaching a ceasefire. And that's why that was put in place. Because I think there seemed to be an idea doing the rounds in both the mainstream media and the alt media that constituted a ceasefire because they called it a limited ceasefire. Well, it's not a ceasefire. The other thing Zelensky apparently confirmed was he's prepared to entertain the idea of a fully fledged ceasefire. Well, not sure exactly what he thinks that means because, again, we're back to this problem between what the Ukrainians' perspective is on a fully fledged ceasefire and what that would entail versus the Russian perspective, which, as we know, are poles apart. So, okay, in principle, he's agreed to it. At least that's a starting point, because prior to that, it was almost like I'm not prepared to have any discussions unless I get certain guarantees put in place to do with security, meaning this rather kind of mythical idea of having NATO forces acting as peacekeepers along this very much fragmented contact line. Now, there is a sort of issue here that the Ukrainians don't agree with, and I'm sure the Russians don't, and that relates to the United States saying it wants to help manage electric and nuclear power plants in Ukraine. Trump says, well, if the US note owns Ukraine's energy facilities, talk about trying to steal assets on the back of a peacekeeping initiative to end a war. He says, well, we can best protect it on that basis. Well, Zelensky apparently came out and said it only was discussed in relation to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which, as we know, has been under Russian control for a very long time. There has been sporadic attacks previously on the infrastructure of that site by the Ukrainians. It's not caused any major damage, fortunately. But the question is Russia really going to hand this over when, as far as Russia's concerned, Zaporozhye is now part of the Russian Federation? Zaporozhye's nuclear power plant is clearly in Zaporozhye. So, I mean, in principle, it sounds like a great idea from Trump, but of course, Trump's real reason for suggesting is it's a backdoor way for the United States to take ownership, literally, of these facilities and then their US assets on Ukraine soil. By all accounts, Zelensky has asked Trump also for defense systems to be implemented. Not sure what they're going to give them, because I think most of what they could have given to Ukraine has already been destroyed. I think Trump, by all accounts, came out with a rather glib statement saying, well, we'll have a think about it, which probably means, yeah, we'll have a think about it. We thought about it for 10 seconds and went, no, you're not having them. So that's the nuts and bolts of it. At least in a way, this might be a situation now where you're not exactly necessarily going to get the Ukrainians and the Russians talking together, although Zelensky claims he's prepared to do so, but seeing's believing. But for now, the next scheduled meeting between the United States and Russia is in Jeddah on the 24th, and that's to continue discussions. Again, there is no deal in place. The idea, some people were suggesting that Putin and Trump were going to have this conversation and agree a deal. I'm sorry, that's not how it works. They haven't even got teams on either side who would be put in place to have discussions leading to a potential ceasefire or potential lasting peace agreement. So hardly going to see presidents getting on the phone and reaching an agreement, because there's no detail being agreed upon other than this, not the greatest use of words, limited ceasefire relating to energy infrastructure, both obviously within Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a sad thing. There's an old saying, well, relative old saying, that nothing's officially over until the assets are divided up. And, I go back to something that Trump recently was talking with reporters about, and in regards to concessions. And the only thing he was talking about was, well, we'll be talking about land. We'll be talking about power points or power plants. We are already talking that dividing up certain assets. Go to what's going on in the Panama Canal, working to pull it out of the hands of the Chinese to take over that those businesses, Greenland, et cetera, et cetera. When I hear these things about the U.S. president whining about, oh, so many people dying, I feel for the people, and yet primarily out of his mouth, he's talking about what assets can we acquire, confiscate, partner, et cetera. You really have to truly wonder what is on the agenda from the U.S. in regards to the end of Ukraine. Is it to end the war, or is it just a means by which the U.S. can get into Eurasia and have business controls, which eventually lead to more military and geopolitical ones?
Well, I think with Ukraine, there is no military objective. I mean, it's very obvious what Russia said. The US is not going to get tangled up with Russia and Ukraine. It's more to do with the fact that, as far as Trump's concerned, it's a business deal. We've spent 100, 150 billion, $200 billion, who knows what they've actually spent, and we want our money back. So we want control of assets, hence this mineral deal. Notice that was not discussed. It wasn't on the agenda. That thing's just gone due south for now, maybe due south permanently, because I think there's a realization that A, there aren't the assets there people thought there was, and B, Ukraine's promised it to countless other nations who they've signed all these security cooperation agreements with. But there's no doubt Trump sees this as an opportunity to go, well, if we own these assets, then Russia's not going to bomb them, which of course is absolutely true. But there is no way Kiev's going to agree to that, because that is just backdoor way of stealing assets on the premise that, well, that's a way to ensure a ceasefire stays in place. But A, there's no ceasefire agreed, and B, even if it is, it's after 30 days, it's redundant. So then what? We go back to attacking these energy facilities. And so protecting them is one thing, and even then, the United States isn't going to commit anyone to protecting them who's from the United States themselves. You can say we have ownership, but and again, how does that happen? You can't just unilaterally say from Zelensky's perspective, here you go, US, you can have whatever energy assets or energy infrastructure we have, including the electric power stations, nuclear power stations, etc., etc. So I think the next point is this idea perhaps Ukraine is telegraphing the end of the war, and it's a lot sooner perhaps than people would imagine. Equally, some may argue, and I would, it's too many weeks too late. But what we're hearing, and this has to be confirmed, is there is a belief that Ukraine is not intending to extend martial law past early May. This is also to include mobilization. So what's supposed to happen on that basis is, as of the end of that date, then there is no martial law, there is no mobilization. One could arguably say that's the end of the war. That might seem a bit of a stretch for some people, and I appreciate why people would think that. But this may be telegraphing the fact that the war's over. At that point, it may just be notionally a date where someone said, well, by that date, there is a belief that there will be sufficient grounds, maybe not to have, obviously, a permanent agreement in place, but enough to end the war on the basis that some kind of ceasefire becomes permanent within a matter of weeks, rather than, well, we're having a ceasefire for 30 days and then war will resume. As a matter of fact, they're very different scenarios. There is also claims that there might be a chance that in this period Zelensky will step down. The argument would be, if martial law is over, then they can have elections, which is entirely possible. But obviously that has to be confirmed, and things can mean one thing today and then change tomorrow or next week. So it remains to be seen, but we're talking probably roughly 6 weeks or so for that to be the case. But I think it would be, certainly from a constitutional perspective, if you end martial law, then you could legitimately say, well, now we can have an election. And I think I support the Ukrainians' perspective on this, to try and have an election in Ukraine when there's a war going on. Okay, certain parts largely don't suffer too much military damage or too many Russian missiles coming their way, but there's parts where there are quite densely populated that arguably, Kharkov being one thing, because as things stand, they would have to vote in an election. So that would be impossible. I mean, you could say, well, Russia could stop firing missiles for a few days to allow the election to happen, but that's just not reality. So we'll see what happens, but this could be potentially a huge development. And it remains to be seen if that comes into force. But this story appears to have legs on some level. It's certainly coming out of the Ukrainian parliament. But we'll see. That could just be someone trying to stoke the fire to try and get rid of Zelensky. I'm sure Zelensky is hardly popular now amongst many people within the Ukrainian parliament. But obviously, there has to be a legitimate election to remove Zelensky from office. And the United States has been very clear, and correctly so, that you can't have another coup or Maidan to remove Zelensky. That is just simply not acceptable, because apart from anything else, maybe the United States has finally realized that overthrowing leaders who are democratically elected is not a good idea. And it certainly would be horrendous for that to happen in the context of everything else that's gone on in Ukraine.
Yeah, and the feasibility of something like this, taking shape very quickly is not out of the realm, because look at what's happened just in the past week. Pretty much we've come to the end of Kursk. That surrounding and even to the point where Trump was asking Putin to spare their lives versus just annihilate them as they go. We have Europe, which is focusing more on building their own defense, having to expend budgets. They're not going to send that money over to Ukraine if they go that much more into debt. So they're looking more at their own backyard. We take a look at, when you're talking elections. Well, I think there's something like 2 million Ukrainians or more. I've heard upwards of 8 million that are outside the country. So how can you really have elections when you have 8 million of your, 2 to 8 million in exile and the inability for them to vote and bring about change? And then, of course, Trump wants the end of the war, so he's going to dangle the stick of military intelligence, arms, and mobility and the like for Zelensky to try to bring about, an end. Because he's come, obviously, Trump knows the realization, and he said it, that the war is over. You're not going to win. And even Zelensky was trying this week on the phone with Trump. Oh, we will win. We have this capacity to win. No, the reality is that Ukraine failed the Kursk offensive, which I put a sort of parallel to the Michael offensive of Germany in 1918. When that was done, the war ended within weeks. The ceasefire came with, just a few months after that. And I think that's what we're seeing is because nearly all of the uh, territorial demands of Russia have been accomplished. Kursk will pretty much end any offensive foray that Ukraine has, and all that will be then is to see about getting a removal of the government. And if that's the case, then the potential for removing martial law, which will open up for elections, that will be, the icing on the cake to what could feasibly be an end to the conflict.
Well, I think it's part of it, but it's also worth noting that people think Putin's rolled over with Trump. Absolutely not. He's standing his ground by saying we need to eliminate the root causes of this crisis. And also, Russia's legitimate interest in the area of security have to be taken into account. So that's back to no NATO membership, neutrality, demilitarization, and obviously, with respect to the Russian speaking people and ethnic Russians in Ukraine. He also talked, rightly, Putin, look, if you're going to have a possible ceasefire, what are you going to do about the entire contact line, all 1,900 kilometers? We also will have to stop forced mobilization in Ukraine and the rearming of the Ukraine armed forces. Maybe that early May date we just spoke of relates to this potentially. He wants a complete cessation of foreign military aid and the provision of intelligence information to Kiev, because the United States is still providing intelligence in a defensive capacity. Okay, there's this energy infrastructure facilities, sort of what you might call sort of semi ceasefire or partial ceasefire for 30 days, but it's kind of rather meaningless. They need to create Russian and American groups for further negotiations starting on the 24th. But if you're going to require that any resolution of the conflict, which the Russians are, would require an end to all military and intelligence assistance to the Ukraine, well, that's a big ask as far as Ukraine's is prepared to accept. And the argument is Russia is not going to back down from that. What's the United States going to do? One thing that is worth noting, the United States has suspended coordinated counterintelligence operations against Russia. That's a goodwill gesture. This relates, of course, partly to Ukraine, but also largely not to it. That was something that came in quite heavily during the Biden administration. Well, they've said we'll stop that. So they're, trying to offer them a small carrot or a small incentive, but effectively, Putin is saying exactly what he said for a considerable period of time. You're not crossing red lines. You need to end the war. You have to deal with our grievances, and you have to end all this foreign military aid and the provision of intelligence to the Ukrainians. Now, if that doesn't happen, they can talk for the next 10 years. It won't end the war. But the problem is, it's one thing Russia and Ukraine speaking about this. It's quite something else to then get the Ukrainians on board to agree with what the Russians and the US have agreed to. But it's worth noting, and you go back to April 2022, when the then Russians and Ukrainians, without any Western influence whatsoever, reached an agreement which ironically was far better for the Ukrainians than any agreement they'll get now. And they agreed to it. So, okay, we've had, unfortunately, 3 years of a war pretty much since then. It's not going to be quite so easy to reach an agreement now on that basis. But at some point, the Ukrainians are going to have to come into this discussion because there's no point Russia and the US agreeing to anything if the Ukrainians refuse, because if Ukraine refuses, the war goes on and Trump can say whatever he likes. And then he's in a very difficult position if the Russians and the US have agreed on something and the Ukrainians don't, because then it's the Ukrainians intransigent that means the war will continue. So what does he do? Does he then have to agree to cut off all assistance to the Ukrainians? But by all accounts, Russia's insisting on that anyway. So this is a very, very difficult situation the US finds itself in. Again, it needs to be extremely careful it doesn't end up owning this war, as we've discussed previously.
No, fully agree. Any final thoughts that you had on this, Paul?
No, I think that's probably good enough for this. We're not here to digest all the other stuff. I think this was just to provide an update on what's currently going on.
Fully agree. Paul, as always, thank you very much for all of your guidance and your insight in regards to this.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for all of your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.